This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan, and I am so grateful to have this place to talk about faith and politics and sex even. Just big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished people who come in goodwill and good faith. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Remember to subscribe. You listen to podcasts, you know the drill, follow, subscribe, all that stuff. But in particular, write a review. If you get a chance, go on, especially Apple Podcasts, because for whatever it's worth, Apple is still the number one podcast, and it really does make a difference in our searchability, findability. If you actually leave us a review, but write a review, or leave a rating and write a review, it really does help. Everything helps get the word out so more people can participate in the conversation like the one we're having today with Mattie Jo Cowsert. Mattie Jo Cowsert is an EXvangelical, and we will discuss yes, I meant to say EXvangelical, not evangelical. So we'll discuss that. Mattie Jo's blog, God, Sex, and Rich People, traces her journey from the Bible Belt to New York City. By the way, say New York for me.
New York.
New York! Yeah, you're from Missouri.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we trace that journey as Mattie Jo deconstructs Christian fundamentalism to embrace personal and sexual freedom. Her book of the same name, God, Sex, and Rich People, will be out this coming winter. Very exciting. And her pilot, based on her series, premiered this year at the Omaha Film Festival. So Mattie Jo, thanks so much for taking the time to join me. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
You know what's funny? Before we hit record, you used the word my people, our people. Like, I think game knows game. Like I shared beforehand that I started out as a New York theater rat. So game knows game. Like I feel like I'm at home with my mishpacha, my people, you know?
Yeah. Yes. I love it. I always say, like, when people ask, like, when did the unraveling of your faith begin? I'm like, well, it really happened when I didn't end up marrying my college sweetheart, and we can go into that later. But I mean, the beginning was when I went, this is part of like the rich people part of my blog, was when I went to theater camp in upstate New York when I was like 14. And like, I raised the money to go, like, I was like car washing in the Walmart parking lot to raise the money to go to this camp for like one session. And then when I got there, I realized, this is a camp for like the 1% offspring. It's like all of them went directly from like boarding school or like the fanciest private schools in Manhattan directly to a summer full of summer camp that cost more than like 4 years of state school college. Anyway, all that to be said, it was there at theater camp where I met my weirdo comrades. Like I'd never been around other theater people before, and many of them Jewish, many of them gay. And I was like, I have a chapter in my book called Everyone's Going to Hell, all caps. And it's about like me meeting Jewish people and gay people at theater camp when I was 14 and being like, oh no, are all of my theater weirdo friends going to hell? Like, that can't be the case. So yeah.
That's so funny, because I was curious about that. I was curious, like, growing up in an evangelical family, going to a church, I forget what denomination it was, a certain kind of Baptist church that your dad preaches at, or it was a pastor at. So a lot of folks going to church have the, I came to the Lord when, this moment of like when they accepted Jesus into their heart, but you also have this trajectory of a lot of folks that I know who are still in the theater or pursuing their creative life. Sometimes there was also this moment when it was like, oh shit, I have to do this theater thing. I have to do this, acting thing. I have did you have a coming to Jesus moment as well as a coming to Sondheim moment?
Yes. Okay. So, fantastic question. And also to clarify, so I was raised like Hillsong United vibes of Christian, which a lot of people would not consider non-denominational as fundamentalist. but it just is dressed in like skinny jeans, tattoos, and like a hot lead pastor, like it's all, my saying is like same song, different choir robes. Like it's all the same when you really get down to it. When we were younger, before I was in junior high and my dad was on staff at that church, we were more Southern Baptist vibe, but technically we were General Baptist, which is different than Southern Baptist, but not really. Like, I mean, I guess actually the only difference, if we really want to get like specific, is that Southern Baptist, like sing, dance, get really crazy. General Baptist, you're not allowed to dance. It's a big no-no. So like more Footloose vibes than like screaming and having a great time at church. Yeah, so that's just a subtle thing. But I was mostly raised Hillsong United, non-denominational, cool Christian. So, and I talk about this in my book, like in terms of my like coming to Jesus moment of my faith, I would say like I became a Christian officially when I was 8 years old because my grandmother died of cancer. And I was suddenly very aware that like at any moment I could die. And I didn't want to go to hell because you get raised, like you're just raised around it. Like you just hear it all the time. And then, but I didn't become like a real Christian until probably like junior high when I was like, I am going to live a countercultural life. I'm going to follow Christ in this very specific way that my church tells me to, but they're going to make me think that I'm free thinking because I read my Bible sometimes. And by sometimes, I mean actually all the time. I read my Bible a lot. But my coming to Jesus moment with my acting, like I truly feel created to do this, was also at theater camp. I don't think it was like a conscious choice. It was just, I was going through a hard time. I had a pretty bad eating disorder at that time in my life. And my parents, this is actually something I don't get asked a lot, so I'm excited to share this part of my story. Yeah. So my parents sort of offered the whole theater camp option as a way to heal me, like give me something to look forward to. And then so I had something other than food to fixate on whenever I was raising the money. And then I ended up raising all of the money and then some. My community really like rallied together to help me. And then I got to camp and I didn't have words for it, but I just felt at home. I was like, this is it. And then I had that feeling again when I visited New York for the first time. So it was like anytime I was around theater, anytime I was around other actors, I just felt a peace that I didn't feel in any other part of my life. And so that was what I allowed to lead me to becoming an actor professionally, was just this like sense of peace and like, yeah, this is what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, so much there. So I'm curious, you had an eating disorder. If I may ask a little bit about that. I was already a Christian. I grew up in a very observant Jewish family, became a Christian when I was 29. And it was a very, very new world to me in a lot of ways. I became a Christian based on a lot of deep, deep theological convictions that I had arrived at. But when I became a Christian, started going to church, it was I wonder if it's a Southern Baptist church. I should look into that. But it's called Grace Baptist. It's a John MacArthur sort of in his shadow kind of a thing. And I was grappling for the first time or starting to name this condition that I had lived with for all of my conscious life, which was eventually diagnosed as bipolar manic depressive. When I first started bringing it up to guys, I was still a baby Christian. It was the early 2000s.
Ooh, baby Christian. You did go to church.
I did. Yeah, we were going for like 10 years. My kids were going to a Christian school.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I was in it. But the thing that I remember when I first brought it up with, I forget if he was an elder at the time. He eventually became an elder at that church. But his response to, hey man, I think I might be grappling with this thing. I can only name as depression. And his response, he was a master's college guy, or it's master's university now. And his immediate response was, you don't have a depression issue, you have a sin issue. So I'm curious if when you started to grapple with an eating disorder, if being it was General Baptist, is that the denomination?
When I was non-denominational at the time that the eating disorder was happening. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you faced that same kind of, like if you were looking for answers, looking to be healthy, like, I don't know, were you faced with some of the same kind of pushback in that regard?
Yeah. Well, I was a teenager, so they were probably like a little nicer to me. But
Okay.
at the end of the day, I was trying. Also, a good question I've never been asked. I was offered support from the church through like an 8-step program. You might be familiar, called Celebrate Recovery.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I went through Celebrate Recovery for anorexia and then again for overeating and exercise bulimia. I basically just like lived with eating disorders for a long time. And they wouldn't come out right and be like and like shame me like, but the language was still there that the reason I was anorexic was because I was worshiping this idea of perfect beauty, of perfection. And don't you know, we're inherently flawed, original sin. You suck without Jesus. You don't have to worry about being perfect because Jesus is perfect for you. So it was like always framed in this way that was like, oh, what a relief. But also, I got myself here. It's my fault because I sinned my way into this idolization of physical perfection. And I internalized that, you know, like, this is my fault. I did this to myself. And luckily, I had 2 parents who were just so afraid of me dying, to be honest, that they were like, whatever, we're getting her professional help. So they were like, we want you to go to therapy. My parents, as boomers, as fucking Baptist boomers,
Yeah.
were like, we're getting you into therapy, which looking back is like incredible. But my father was a big advocate for therapy because he'd done a lot of like counseling with my mom over the years, like both them in counseling and them counseling others. So he like believed in that. Christians like to say counseling, not therapy. But in this case, I really was going to therapy because it was specific for eating disorders. They wanted me to get on antidepressants because I was depressed. So that was another thing too. And I said no to the antidepressants unless I could go to therapy as well, like simultaneously. And so they were like, yeah, sure. That sounds fantastic. So they brought up both options, but I said, I'll do them in tandem. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's a really roundabout way of answering your question. Like, yes, subtly I was shamed for it. And I definitely internalized it as like the reason I was suffering was because I was sinning. And all I needed to do was just stop sinning. But then, and then I also got like professional help, which was helpful. But then what ended up happening is I thought, okay, I'm not afraid of being fat anymore. I'm not afraid of what will happen if I start eating again. But then I kept idolizing this body that I wanted, which just this whole thing plays into another bigger picture of just like how at war I was with my physical body for so long within the faith.
Before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Meza Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Meza and Meza Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mezawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mezawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. You know, I'm curious. I didn't glean too much about your parents, but I got a sense that on the one hand, they're, evangelicals, they're after it Christians, Bible thumping, born again. But on the other hand, I get hints that they're a little bit rebellious within evangelicalism. Is that fair to say?
That is very true. And I do have a few blog posts, a few there's one that's dedicated just to my dad, and it's called Daddy's Girl. And then there's one dedicated to my mom called How to Be a Good Mom, You Idiots. And then, and then there's one dedicated to the both of them called The Fourth Commandment. And it's honor thy father and thy mother. Right. And yes, I would say in this way, I am definitely an exception to a lot of rules in regards to having like religious parents, Christian parents, specifically in the Midwest, in that my parents have always led us by compassion and empathy above all else. Like that is what Jesus represents to them. And so that was always like at the forefront. So when Trump came on the scene, and a lot of their peers were following this person that I call my dad an intellectual Christian and my mom a common sense Christian. Yeah. My dad will always lead from a place of like research and theology, but he also does have like a deep faith. My mom is just like, well, this is stupid. Like, how can you call yourself a Christian and follow a guy and support a guy like Donald Trump? Like, it's just so blatantly obvious to her. So I think that was a really big awakening for my parents. My dad had been through a couple of heartbreaks with the church. He had gotten pushed out of churches in his past in a few ministries, sort of very unjustifiably, and then had more recently gone through that. The church that we were part of for 15 years pushed him out, and he really tried to help that church. Like he was really trying everything, and they just kept pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. So he's really heartbroken by that. So I think those experience combined with their peers supporting Trump was just like, this is a really messed up situation. And we don't identify as whatever it is they're identifying as. And I had already been writing my blog before the 2016 election, and kind of calling out a lot of this stuff. And when my parents and people would ask me, like, what do your parents think of it? And I'd be like, well, my dad just tells me he's happy I'm saying all the things that he thinks. And so, and so I wouldn't say they agree with everything I'm saying, but they're definitely, they don't think I'm wrong. And then also when I went through a sexual assault situation also in 2016, something I never thought I would talk to my family about ever, for many reasons we can get into if you want to. And then I did actually tell my mom. And then when I told her, she told me her story. And then when I shared with the rest of my family, they opened up and shared their stories. And so what I realized is that I had a family full of secrets that I didn't know. And my opening up about it actually allowed us some like honest dialogue about these, structures in our culture that keep uplifting misogyny in very subtle and harmful ways. So I guess, again, like I had empathy and compassion from my parents through this process.
So a lot of what has been coming out in recent years about huge institutions or, these leaders, these pillars in the church must hit particularly close to home for you. I have to share with you that before I even became a Christian, I started reading Ravi Zacharias, listening to his tapes. I started going to his seminars. Long story short, he ended up becoming a personal mentor of mine. So when the stuff came out about Ravi, I talk about having to deconstruct your faith and re-examine a lot of those convictions that led me to do something as drastic as accepting, as becoming a Christian. So I know my experience. It's funny. I started speaking semi-publicly, like at Bible studies, just like being open about the questions that I was sharing. And then, on various platforms, as humble as they may be, like I'm not Joe Rogan, but I do have certain platforms. But one of the first responses I got was someone saying, quoting a fraction of a verse, and I just pulled it up, a person who stirs up conflict in the community. And he was quoting the 6 no 7. And I'm like, dude, read the rest of the fucking thing. Like these 6 things know these 7, because it was coming up in the context of politics as well. And I'm like, you know full well you're a Trump supporter, right? So we can like skip ahead to the second half of one verse, but let's read the rest of the thing and re-examine like what we're really valuing. Anyway, I bring this up to ask you, like, so I was reading one of your posts, and God first, others second, I'm third. And I love the links, by the way. They're so helpful, like all these links.
Cool.
I go to the link, and it goes to Kanakuk. Freaking Kanakuk.
Let's talk about Kanakuk.
Let's talk about freaking Kanakuk. Like, but that's the one. Okay, so tell folks. A lot of folks don't know what Kanakuk is, and Nancy French has done such great investigative reporting on the camp.
Amazing.
But can you fill folks in on Camp Kanakuk and all? And you have a personal connection to.
Oh yeah, Kanakuk is in my hometown. I grew up in Branson/Hollister, Missouri. Branson won't claim Hollister because we're like the white trash neighbor. But it's just because we don't get as many tax dollars in our area code. Because Branson is like very tourist heavy, like it's a pretty big tourist attraction. It's also home of Kanakuk Kamps. And when I was so I grew up around Kanakuk. Everybody worked at Kanakuk. Everybody had like family that was on staff at Kanakuk, and Kanakuk was a really expensive camp. So for many of us that couldn't afford to go, they just became camp counselors. My blog is dedicated to my sister, who got like super fucked up by Kanakuk because she worked for their ministry for years. She worked for their white savior camp, is what I call it. It's called KAA, and it's this like fully scholarship camp, but it's all Black kids. And so like, meanwhile, the white kids at like the regular camps are paying $4,000 a month to go, however much it is. I just know it's expensive. Anyway, all that to be said, the culture, we call it the Kana culture, was pervasive growing up. And what I mean is that there was definitely like an in and an out. Like if you were in the Kanakuk crowd, that was like you were in, like those were the cool Christians, And I talk about this in like one of my very first vlogs of like my perception of like a Kanakuk godly woman, and I just couldn't. I would never quite be them because they were supposed to be like ethereal and wear like baggy sports clothes and never wear makeup, and that was supposed to be like the figure of beauty. And I was like, no, I wore the shit out of some Dream That Moose. And I really liked clothes that fit, and so anyway, Kanakuk was everywhere. And I still to this day, I mean, I don't even know, maybe some people back home listen to these podcasts I record, maybe not, but I have friends who's like, they still work for Kanakuk. And so my family and I always kind of like not turned our nose up, but we felt snuffed by the Kana culture. Let's put it that way. And then I saw my sister and just like how hard she tried to get the approval of the people at that camp. And then I was part of a mission group in college, and I had this Bible study leader, and she graduated from the Kanakuk Institute. I don't know, it's some like BS Bible studies certificate. Another probably just like, revenue generator. But she and her husband both went to the Kanakuk Institute, and they were just like every brand of Christian I thought was like so vom worthy. And I felt so suffocated in that group. And I thought, this mission group that actually has a really great statement. I feel like I like cannot wait to get the F out of here. And I write a lot about that experience in my book. And so then I also grew up listening to Pete Newman. He preached on Wednesday nights. People would go to see Pete speak. He was in and out of our schools. Like going to lunches with the kids and like whatever, which sounds fucking creepy because it is. Like, but we didn't see anything of it because all the youth pastors in the area got passes to come have lunch with the high schoolers. Like, it just wasn't weird. And then fast forward where now he is in prison for multiple accounts of child molestation. And my peers, my friends, were his students. And I know for a fact many of them are still very traumatized by the situation. And now with everything coming out about it, it's just, even messier than ever, because many of them still don't feel comfortable talking about it because of all the NDAs and even though the guy's in prison. So yeah, that's Kanakuk.
Yeah. But it is pervasive because there's this kind of trench mentality. I don't know how to describe it, but it's like this mentality of like, be on the defensive to protect the brand in a way. That's almost not a fair way to put it because it's a whole, it pervades every fiber of our being, of our thinking, of our feelings, of our spiritual life, of our history. It's like, no, you have to protect. In Kanakuk's case, if you say this and this becomes public, it's going to ruin all the great work that we're doing. All of the great ministry that we're doing.
It's going to distract from.
Yeah, distract from. Yeah. So, wow. So it was so ironic when I clicked at God first, others second, I'm third. But in a way, it's like a grooming thing. Like when you read it in the context, it's a grooming thing.
So for listeners, like God first, others second, I'm third. What that blog post is talking about is I had this experience with my sexual trauma therapist where I realized that this idea of I'm third, putting myself third, which is a Kanakuk phrase. You wear it on necklaces, it's on bracelets, there are shirts. There's like literally an I'm third way on the Kanakuk campus. That's like a name of a street. And like I said, I didn't even go to Kanakuk, but I knew this term. And that idea that you put others and God before yourself, what it does is it creates a whole lifestyle of self-negligence. And you get to a point where you don't even know what you want as an individual. But you're also taught that doesn't really matter because what you want is sinful anyway, because that's the flesh, right? And all that matters is what God wants. So that's why you're putting God first, because it doesn't really matter what you want. And you just get to a point where you're like, I don't know what I want. I definitely don't know how to communicate what I want. And I am putting people first in the most subtle of ways. In that blog post, I talk about how like I wouldn't speak up for myself in sexual situations because I didn't want to like hurt the guy's feelings, or like guys that I didn't want to go on second or third dates with, I would end up going on fifth, sixth, seventh dates with because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. I was putting his ego above my like personal felt safety. And I had to learn how to not do that anymore. So to your point, it's incredibly pervasive because I was 27 when I was reckoning with this.
Wow.
Yeah.
So one of the things that surprised me once I started getting to know, like once you get behind closed doors, behind the like presentational part of like, I shared this on a recent conversation about there's a certain kind of veneer of evangelism that people like present. It's like, I'm good looking, my wife's gorgeous, I'm rich, I'm successful, my teeth are white, my kids are the captain of the soccer team, and they could beat up your kids, and they get straight A's. Therefore, we must be right. Now accept Jesus into your heart. That version of evangelism. But when I got behind closed doors and I started like going through life with some of these folks, this is a very specific thing. I was surprised that more teenagers in the church were getting pregnant, getting STDs than even when I was growing up in the 80s. I grew up in like, we were all Jews and Italians in central Jersey. And, we were the...
Wait, where in Jersey are you from?
So my family's all from Brooklyn, but I grew up in Freehold, or the Freehold area. We were on Manalapan. Yeah.
My boyfriend's from Mattawan.
Oh, yeah. That's like 3 towns over. Yeah.
Yeah, I always joke that I got my Italian. Unfortunately, he's from New Jersey.
Unfortunately.
not Florence. Anyway, go ahead.
But I mean, it's not to say none of our friends growing up in the 80s were getting pregnant or anything, but I was amazed at the pervasiveness of like problems. And yet here's the kids from, Grace Baptist, all pure and stuff. And all of them are getting the STDs. Us, we were like, supposedly, what do you call it? Promiscuous beyond measure. It was a much lower, it's not to say nobody was, but it was a much lower percentage. But so when I was reading about the purity ring, so can you explain to me what the purity ring is? And purity ring over like actual sexual, sex education and,
yeah. I mean, we didn't even have sexual education in my school. We had abstinence only education, which was actually something I learned the Clinton administration. I thought it was the Bush administration, but no, the Clinton administration did that. So anyway, I did not get any sexual education. And the purity ring, the purity ring was not my parents' idea. Though my parents definitely promoted and encouraged sex within a marriage, they did not, and they definitely like upheld it as the best way. I think ultimately my parents just wanted us to feel safe and loved and respected by the person we were going to have sex with. And because they, in their minds, they probably thought we were all going to get married at the same time they did, which was like 18 and 19. But that only works if you get married very young. Otherwise, you can have sex with lots of people where you feel safe, loved, and respected that aren't going to be your husband. And if you do, or wife, and if you do wait for that, I don't know. That was a big part of my just deciding not to wait until I was married anymore, or not to wait until I was married anymore, is because I was like, at what point does it just become weird that you are just completely siphoning off this entire part of your human experience in terms of age? But all of that to be said, the purity ring was trendy. It was like a Kanakuk thing as well. It was just performance, essentially. Like, if you are a Christian girl and if you are claiming to be Christ-like, well, the way to show it is by wearing a ring on your left finger until the day that you're married. And then on that day, you replace that ring with a ring from your husband to symbolize that your purity ring symbolizes that you belong to God and your father until the day that you get married. And then that symbolizes that you belong to your husband. And growing up, I did not have any qualms with that language. Once I got a little older,
belong to thing. Yeah, that makes me feel very uncomfortable. Yeah. I can imagine if I went to Savannah, my oldest kid, and like, hey, you belong to me. Savannah, they'd be like, yeah, you and the horse you rode in on can both go fuck yourself.
Yeah, exactly. But that was the language. And like, we all had them. Like if you didn't have a purity ring, if you weren't at least like trying to fake that you were saving yourself until marriage, well, then you were just like blatantly a whore. And the only girls who did that were the girls who we all knew were having sex and like, about them. Right. So yeah, and I wore that thing. Oh my God, I still have it somewhere. It is so bent up. The diamond is missing. I like to say that this is very indicative of like my purity efforts because it just looks gnarly. But yeah, so I wore that ring like even after I had sex, I still wore it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So as I was reading more and more of your stuff, I was imagining scenes that could be included in your series that I know will not only get made, but will be very successful because so many people can relate. But one of the types of scenes, it could be a recurring one actually, is, going back home and encountering so-and-so that you went to church with, whether it's your friends, your bestie's mom that, I'm praying for MJ. I'm praying for Mattie Jo, or it's your best friend that ended up like, putting on the costume of like, I'm a good Christian, and following all the rules and all that stuff. So have you encountered folks like that when you going back home or, how are those interactions if you do?
Oh dear.
Should we start drinking now? Is it like
yeah, right. If I didn't have to go back to work after this, absolutely. No, so it's interesting because my two best friends from college definitely did the whole like what you're supposed to do thing. They both married their first boyfriends. They were both married by like 23 years old. One of them is still very devout. She's actually a missionary in Turkey. And then the other one is like not super, super duper Christian, but still like they live in Little Rock and like they're conservative in culture, but like they're not hyper religious. But I haven't gotten a ton of like blatant pushback from the one who's a missionary in Turkey. I would love to at some point sit down and chat with her about like, where have things gone awry between the two of us? Like, is there stuff that you secretly would like really like to confront with me, you know? And then with my other best friend, we've like butted heads on some things more around like my sexual immorality. And I talk about that in the book. But when I go home, it's not so much blatant, like, oh, I'm praying for you. It's things like this. I'll give you two examples. I went home for my 10-year reunion and we were taking a group picture, me and my classmates, and this guy that I like literally went to school since kindergarten together, grabbed my butt during the picture. And I turned around, giving him a look of absolute fury. And he goes, oh, whoa. What are you going to do? Me too, me? And he goes, I know what you write on the internet, Mattie Jo, okay? As if, like, so his idea is that since I write about sex on the internet, that must mean I'm okay with him grabbing my body parts. And then later he comes up to me and he apologizes. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of nice. Until he says, I didn't realize you had a boyfriend. I would have never done that. Oh, so my body belongs to my boyfriend. And that's why you shouldn't have touched me. Not because you shouldn't have fucking touched me. Yeah. Like that, right? So it's that kind of like insidious like belief that I see come out. Another time I have actually a Hebrew tattoo on my arm, Eshet Chayil, Proverbs 31.
Eshet Chayil,
yeah. So I got it because, Proverbs 31 was just like drilled into my head and basically like used as this like propaganda of how to be the best version of a woman to be desirable by God and by a man. It was on every journal, every coffee mug, every fucking hoodie. Proverbs 31, be Proverbs 31 woman. And I was like, I hate this verse. Then I learned about Eshet Chayil, which is woman of valor. And it's a prayer said to thank women in the Jewish tradition for everything they do. And I thought, that's a fun reclamation. So I double checked with all my Jewish friends and I was like, is this super awful of me as a shiksa to get Hebrew tattooed on my body? And they were like, no. I mean, anybody who cares about that cares about a lot of other things that Jews who don't care about that don't care about, right? And I was like, okay, so that's not. So anyways, I have Hebrew on my body. When people in New York see the Hebrew on my body, they talk to me in Hebrew and hope that I'm single, right?
Yeah.
They come up to me at the gym, like I'm like, oh no. It's a long story. And then, but when people back home see my tattoo, they ask me about it and I say, oh, it's based on Proverbs 31. Before I can continue my story, amen. Yeah. And then I just stop talking. I'm like, it's not the rest of the breath I have. It's little things like that, But I also, this is another very specific, I am the Regina George of the Ozarks. Because her hair is full of secrets. So that reference from Mean Girls. Because people back home, when they have things that they feel like is like salacious information, they share it with me because they know there will be no judgment. They know I am a safe space because I understand where they come from and I have an understanding of like Christian evangelical context and culture, but I'm not going to judge them because I now live fully in the secular world, free from all of that. Right. So I know a lot. I know a lot of what goes on back home. So it's this interesting like dichotomy of reactions. Yeah.
So you've mentioned getting more politically engaged. We haven't talked about that yet, But I know in my experience, I had some very significant theological questions, if not conflicts. The first one that came up, the church that we went to for about a decade plus was Young Earth Creation Church, 6 literal 24-hour days, 5,000 something years ago. And I remember kind of teasing out this conversation with, the new pastor when he came and we talked long and hard about it. I'm like, listen, I know my people. Like my people at the foot of Mount Sinai, let's just grant you that God's voice boomed from Mount Sinai and he said, he got to the day part. I can guarantee you not one of those 2 million plus or minus people said, I wonder if he means a literal 24-hour day.
Yeah.
So so we had some fun conversations about theology, but when I started questioning politics, whether it was in my kids' Christian school or at the church, then shit got real. Like we were at the kids had like I said, they were going to Trinity Classical Academy. It's a Christian school, and they had these monthly community get-togethers. They'd often bring in a special speaker, and it was often, I noticed that there was this pattern of like one super hyper conservative after another. And then finally, they brought in this one speaker. She had grown up in Eastern Europe before the Berlin Wall was taken down, on that side of communism. And she gave an hour-long talk on the Marxism, communism, socialism, and possibly even Islamic terrorism of Barack Hussein Obama. And I'm like, first of all those things don't go together. But I got up at the end and I'm like, what does this have to do with classical Christian education? That's all I said. And man, we were physically in danger. The second that I questioned, wait, well, what does this have to do with classical Christian education? I didn't even hint at what my views about President Obama were. It just even questioning, no. You're hinting at the fact that you don't hate him enough for us, So anyway, sorry, long way around the barn of asking this question. Has this become an issue for you? If you're even remotely unorthodox from a political standpoint or social issues, have you had to face a lot of pushback on that?
Yeah. So the thing is I was never actively political until the 2016 election because, talking politics and religion without killing each other, not possible in my family. My father is very conservative. Well, I would say he's he still maintains some ideas in conservatism, but he's definitely not a Trump supporter, right? He's not that version. This version of the GOP, not his party. But he did vote for Bush, he was always going to vote for someone who isn't in favor of big government. His views have changed some, but anyway. But my brother, on the other hand, is a raging liberal. And it always caused massive blow-ups anytime my family started the conversation. Huge. And screaming, it was, and so I was like, I'm not interested. Doesn't affect me, that was my whole thing. However, I will say this. I had to write a 16 to 20 page research paper for an English, a dual credit college course my senior year of high school on any topic that we wanted to research. It was an election year. It was 2018. So I was like, 2018, 2008. And so I was like, I'll do it on the election because then I can this is my first time voting. I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Right. And I went in fully thinking that I was going to vote for McCain. I just assumed I would. Everybody around me is conservative, whatever. And then I did all this research. And as I was researching, I was like, I feel like I align more with Obama in all of his policies. I was like, this makes way more sense to me than what McCain is presenting. And I think that this is how we should do things, right? Vote for the world you want to live in, not the one that you do. And that's, so in the end, I was like, that's my summary conclusion, gonna vote for Obama. Right before I go in to vote for Obama, I had decided this, and my sister, she would be horrified if I was telling this story, and I don't think she remembers this, but I'm gonna vote for Obama, whatever. Mattie, I really think that he's and she gives me all of these reasons why she thinks he's basically part of the Taliban. And she scares me out of voting for him. So in the end, I voted for John McCain. All right. So this is my experience with politics 2016. Then I go through all of my deconstruction, and I'm figuring out all of this in my own life. Like, oh, actually, the evangelical church doesn't care about true love or unconditional. I don't want to say true love, unconditional love, grace, like none of that. It's all just like a ploy for power and control, which makes sense since the inception of the organized Christian religion is the Catholic Church, which has always been about power and control, and money and whatever. So then when Trump came on the scene, I was furious because I was like, wait. This used to just be like a little personal thing I was going through. Now this is national. And this is like permeating and perversing everything. And oh my God, I cannot have the people who I just spent the last 3 years of my life untangling myself from their systems and their cellular, cellular belief system, cellular commentary on like everything, right? It's like, I always say the mental and emotional gymnastics it requires to deconstruct your faith. It's just like at every angle, you like try to gain some freedom. And then you've got like youth pastor Jiminy Cricket being like, but you're being a relativist. You're probably going to hell now, you know? And so it's so hard. You have to just like, it's faith whack-a-mole, you know? And I was like, I've just done all of this work. And now these people, they're going to elect this president.
Yeah.
All of the misogyny that I had like been uncovering and fighting, and then I just got angry and I just got fueled up. And then to directly answer your question, yeah, basically I would just be pushed back on as like an angry woman, and why am I so upset? And I'm like, why am I so upset? And like they just couldn't see things the way that I did. And the more conversations I got into with people like that, because I do think that there's something to be said about sitting down and actually, I know you've mentioned this on your podcast, like actually having conversations versus like living on a screen and typing. But the more of those conversations I got into, I was like, this has to go so far back and so much undoing of like our just fundamental operations to make any true headway. Like, for example, when my uncle was like, well, we were talking about Planned Parenthood and my experience with Planned Parenthood and why I love them and support them so much. And he was like, well, if women want to be sexually active, they should have to pay for their health care. And I was like, okay, there's so much wrong with that. We're not going to see eye to eye. There's so much wrong with what you just said. And I'm not going to teach you why everything's wrong with what you just said, you know?
Right.
So, yeah. So if that answers your question.
It does. Yeah. And it is a quandary for so many people that grew up in the church or are part of a church and, you know, have deep theological convictions that guide you should be able to guide your spiritual life without so much ambivalence, you know?
Yeah.
So it is a tangled web. I'm curious where your spiritual life is now, where your beliefs are now.
Yeah. So I actually have a series of blogs about this too, starting with the title of the first one is Hell Yes. Oh, fuck. And it's when when I came to terms with the fact that I'm not a Christian. And then I have 2 follow-up posts called Hell No, part 1 and 2. And it's dissecting this concept of hell. So yeah, I would say through my experience, because basically how it worked for me is, I say that my entire identity was dismantled thanks to my Jewish roommate and Tinder. And basically what happened is I was having these experiences that were directly in conflict with what I had been told to be absolute truth. But it wasn't enough for me as a good evangelical, can't trust my own experiences. It wasn't enough for me to just have those experiences and walk away from my entire identity, even though I didn't know that's what I was actually doing. I needed to understand scripture better, and I needed to understand, like, why does this just not feel right for me? And so basically, I went out with this Jewish guy, and I had this like equally yoked panic attack, and I was like, I can't date a Jewish guy. And my roommate was like, what's so bad about dating a Jewish guy? I was like, well, because we're not of the same faith background. And he was like, so that's important to you? And I was like, of course, because I can't date someone who thinks so differently than me. Like, I wouldn't date a Mormon. And he was like, oh yeah, Mormons, they're crazy. And I could sense that he was being sarcastic. And I was like, I mean, do you know what they believe, Andrew? And he was like, yeah. And he like names off some things. I was like, yeah, that's fucking crazy. And he goes, yeah, no, I get it. Christians get miracles. Everyone else gets stuff they made up. And I was like, I have that's true. You know, like I suddenly was like, oh. And then he sent me on like a reading path and he gave me all of these books to read. He was actually very well read when it came to the New Testament. And so I read like Zealot by Reza Aslan. I got into Bert. I always get it wrong. Is it Bart Ehrman? Bart Ehrman's
Bart Ehrman.
Yeah. And I just went down a rabbit hole of textual criticism. And then I was like, oh my God, I don't think Jesus is who they told me he was. And that reality is going to change everything about my life, whether I want to or not. And on the one hand, I felt huge relief that I didn't have to live in accordance to all of this purity culture. I didn't have to believe my Jewish neighbors were going to hell. I didn't have to try hard to convert Muslims. I didn't have to only date Christian guys. Like all of a sudden I felt this like freedom. But on the other hand, I had no idea how to move forward without the Bible being this blueprint for life, right? And it took me probably another like 5 years until I went to church with like a very like affirming church. And they said, it was communion, and they were like, and we just want you to know, we know at some churches, like they don't allow you to come up here and take this unless you call yourself a Christian. We're welcoming of anybody, And I was like, I still can't do it. I'm not a Christian. I can't, like, because I don't believe that Jesus is God incarnate. I don't believe in original sin. And those feel like really big hitters if you're going to call yourself a Christian. And so that's why I can't, because I just like those two things alone are enough to be like, well, I don't like, there are a few things you sort of have to buy into, and I don't really. So,
yeah. I'm going to really oversimplify and overly distill stuff. But, my dad and I, as you can imagine, have had this to this day, ongoing conversation, about, Jesus, about why I became a Christian. And I was
going to say, are you like the Asher Lev of your family? Do you know that reference?
No.
Asher Lev. Anyway, he's this artist, this Jewish artist that like painted a famous like crucifix, I think it was. And oh my gosh, the pushback he got from like the Jewish community. Anyway, I saw a play about it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I almost thought, so there was talk at a certain point about doing this independent film about the Jew from Jersey who becomes a Christian. A lot of stories there, but and there was funding for it, but the kicker was, well, when does the dad accept Jesus into his heart? I'm like, that's so uninteresting to me. Because it's about a father and a son and having this hard conversation. And, so my dad actually, he has a very nuanced view of Jesus. He thinks that Jesus was a prophet in the tradition of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Malachi. He also thinks that what we Jews think of as a tzaddik, like the great rabbi of his generation, or at least a great rabbi of his generation. And when it comes to the Messiah thing, he's like, he was a Messiah candidate. Could have been. Yeah, but he says, at first he said, but he's obviously a failed Messiah candidate because my father's still Jewish. He wears a yarmulke. He's, later, when we revisited the conversation, he had read, I don't know if you're familiar with N.T. Wright and his history work on first century Israel or, Canaan or whatever. But he had been reading Yoder and some pretty heady stuff. And he came to the conclusion that failed Messiah candidate, but the failure wasn't his. It was a failure of the people of Israel of his generation. And I thought that's probably a more nuanced view than almost every Christian, most Christians, not every Christian, but like that's a really nuanced view of the historical Jesus and the impact that he had theologically on Judaism. And if we look at it historically, I think that someone like Constantine had a much bigger shaping effect on modern Christianity than Jesus did. If we're really being honest about it.
10,000%. I do think like something in terms of like politics and tying Jesus into politics. I think a lot of progressive Christians want to like pose Jesus as this like social justice warrior of his time, and that's true. In some of the Gospels, he is very much that. In some of the Gospels, he's kind of wackadoodle, end times crazy. And I think we miss that. I think it's like, yeah, but in this one, he talks a fuck ton about coming back before the end of this generation, bringing the kingdom of God on earth. It reads more like Revelation than it does like a social justice warrior, But people don't read that Jesus. Christians try to conflate Jesus, right? Like when you hear the birth story of Christmas, you get a bunch of details from like the 3 different Gospels that even have the birth story because it's not in John. And so you do that with the Christians. And then I think progressive Christians do the like selective Jesus, which is okay because A.J. Jacobs wrote this great book, highly recommend, called, oh my gosh, now I'm going to blank on it. Know It All. And he spends a year following the Bible literally. And his conclusion, okay, I'm going to ruin it for you. He is like, there's this phrase called cafeteria Christian that people use in the Christian tradition to kind of poo-poo people who just pick and choose the Christianity they want to follow. In his research and his experience, everyone is a cafeteria Christian. They all sort of like zoom in on one thing and then extract from there. And that's like every single Christian. And of course, that's understandable. The Bible is a big book. Like there's a lot to gravitate towards and push away from. But anyways, so I think progressive Christians are sort of like guilty of that too. They leave out this kind of like end timesy holding a sign on the highway Jesus, and then also in terms of Constantine, like what I say is that the very inception of organized Christianity, in my opinion, in my research, was an anti-Semitic movement. And I think Reza Aslan comes to the same conclusion at the end of Zealot. And so these things that sort of keep popping out about Christians, like, oh, they're anti-Semitic, even though like there's a lot going on with the Palestine-Israel thing right now that would suggest non-Christians and progressives are anti-Semitic, or is there this way that we can get back to like the Christianity that's really just following Jesus? I'm like, I don't know, y'all, because when it was like very much created to be something that we could organizingly follow, if that's a word, it was done so for power and oppression. So I don't know if you can ever get really back to like I think you can get to the heart of like pieces of Jesus and what is consistent, but also you have to look at texts that are outside the Bible, that are contemporaries of the Bible. Like I have this whole bit in my book about how I picture the Council of Nicaea went. And because that was just like, evangelicals love to be like, God breathed. The scripture is God breathed. I'm like, what about the book, the Bible that the Catholics have? It has more books than ours. Which one's God breathed, And then it's really just these are the books that they decided were in line with what they wanted to forward, which is Jesus as a Trinity. Because not everybody believed that Jesus was God. Not everybody believed that Jesus was fully human. They're the Gnostics, right? Like there were all these different beliefs, but they were like, what do we want him to be? 3 in 1, good to go. Let's call it for lunch. And then when they came back, they were like, okay, only books that support that perspective, And so I'm just like, okay, well, we can't really know who he is. And instead of the faith being like, I'm going to call myself a Christian and whether I'm right or not, I don't know, but what I do know is that I'm going to heaven and everybody else is going to hell. Maybe the faith is, this is what I believe. I don't really know if it's true, but everybody else is allowed to believe what they want. But that's not what evangelism is. That's not what evangelicalism is. That the Great Commission of Christianity doesn't allow for you to just be like, laissez-faire, you know?
Yeah. That's a whole other.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, but yeah, I see where you're coming from, and we've talked a lot about the colonization of the Christian sect of Judaism. That's a whole other series, let alone conversation.
Yeah.
What's it like writing a book? So you've written a lot, but the process of writing a book must be very different.
Yeah. I do want to say one thing before we move on. Something that's been on my mind this whole conversation is you must have been like a hit in Christian churches, because you were probably like, the Jewish conversion mascot, right? Like they were just all
mascot
like,
is a great word for it.
This is a case for Christ personified, guys.
Oh man.
I've just been thinking that this whole time.
I have to confess that I embraced it, especially early on, about, sharing my testimony, because I recognized that it was a unique testimony, especially one where I wasn't just like a casual Jew. Like I wasn't Jew-ish, as what's his name, referred to himself. I was like, we kept kosher. We went to Shabbos. We were observant. Yeah. And it's still, I'm still Jewish. I've never felt more Jewish, by the way, since you brought up the war. But yeah, sharing that testimony about how I came to the Lord. One of the first times I had to go before the church, and this church, Grace, at the time, there were, I don't know, somewhere between probably about 3,500 people going on any given weekend. So I went, shared testimony before every service, and it happened to be Passover, the first and second night of Passover. And there's a question, fair kasha, the four questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? It's because the Jew from Jersey is telling everybody how he became a Christian. That's why it's different. So it was. But like I said, the film that was never made because they wanted it to end with Ronnie, Chaim Rubin becoming a Christian. I'm like, no, this is way more interesting if the father and the son still have to figure out how to work, how to live together, how to love each other, how to continue having conversations and figuring this stuff out together. That to me was much more interesting. But
and I will also go back to the book conversation, but that is something that I've gotten a lot of feedback on my proof of concept pilot that I submitted to a lot of different festivals, and we got super close at Tribeca Film Festival in their New Work series. But anyway, they don't give feedback super often, but like the feedback that I did get was a lot of people were very unsatisfied with my father's role in it. They were like, it doesn't really make sense. I'll send it to you. You can watch it.
I'd love to, yeah.
It doesn't really make sense. Like, seems like he's really supportive of her and like she really loves him. Wouldn't it make more sense if he was like shaming her? And I'm like, no, because what is worse than feeling loved by your pastor dad, but only feeling loved because he believes you're following a certain set of rules, but you're secretly not. But like, he loves you, but you're afraid to lose that love. That's what's supposed to be happening here. But instead people, and then also like the display of, hey, we can actually like love each other even though we're different, but that conflict can still remain, and that would be further on in the series. But yeah, I think people just really want a child parent feud. And also these people probably just really want the person in the end to get saved because that's a success story, Yeah.
And a lot of really bad films have been made based on, they shared the gospel real clearly, He talked about Jesus and it's the greatest thing since Cain Mutiny, no, it's really not. Bad acting is still bad acting. Bad writing is still bad writing.
So in terms of writing a book,
in terms of bad writing, no, I'm just kidding.
In terms of bad writing,
no, that must be so different than writing. Like you're a really talented writer, but I've been digesting a lot of your. It's writing for one particular medium has to be very different than writing something long form. That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. It's been a long journey. And it's my first book. So, my whole goal with this process was to learn how to write a book. So I think my next books will not be as arduous as this one, for the reasons that this one was, because with this one, I was kind of like, I was really trying to figure out, like, how do I get from this end to this end? What is the story arc? And then also, like, they always talk about, like, killing your darlings. Like, what do I take out? Like, and I tried just to, like, put it out there and then let my editor do the work of that. But yeah, it's still quite long, and it probably needs some cuts still, because then you still have the process of getting published, which is a whole other thing. So, like, just full disclosure, we're saying winter, spring 2024, but I have recently decided to try to get a 3-book deal.
Oh.
So I don't know if it'll be out winter, spring 2024. It might be longer, but sign up for my email list. You'll get updates. I just wrote a recent blog post about that. But because when I first started writing it, I was just doing it as like a COVID project, because I always knew I was going to write a book eventually. I just didn't know when the time would be. And then it was like, oh, COVID, seems like now's the time. And then I was just putting stuff on Facebook. And then from Facebook, a reader of my blog was an editor at a new publishing house, an indie publishing house. And she was like, would you be interested in getting published? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. So that kind of put a fire under my butt to, like, get my proposal and whatnot together. And that made it, like, real, like, oh, I am writing a book now. But then through those negotiations with that publishing house, I ultimately decided not to go with them. And I talked to a bunch of other friends who are authors and whatnot. And there's a lot we don't have to get into the weeds about in terms of, like, the publishing biz and what is there and what money is there and what's worth it and what's not worth it. I ended up in the end being like, you know what, if I'm not going to make any money as a first-time author anyway, I would rather just be the executive of all of this. So I'm going to hire an editor. I'm going to hire a publicist. I'm going to hire my cover artist. I'm going to hire my designer. I'm going to find my beta readers. And that's what I did. And so it's been like 3 years, and it might be until this fall until you can actually, like, read it, but it is done.
Okay, great. Exciting stuff. So I need to ask, we've touched on some of this already, but I want to ask you the TP&R question, which is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So people who think differently than we do, have different beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
Ooh, that's a great question. I love when you ask that question. I do believe respectful discourse is possible, but you have to have two parties who are in favor of and on the same team in that regard. Like, hey, I'm going to present this side. You're going to present your side. Not that we're trying to change each other's minds, but this is why I believe what I do. And then deep breaths, sitting back, relaxing, and not taking it personally. So I do believe that it's possible. I just think in this particular climate where it is so culture war-y and literal war-y with the Palestine-Israel situation, like, you can't say, if you say one thing off, oh, you're pro-Palestine, oh, you're pro-Israel, which means you're not for Palestine. There's, like, no nuance in anything. Identity politics is at an all-time high. And so that is tough, because it's like you will so easily be put in one category or another. So I think that's where just both parties, whoever it may be, understand those ground rules. Like, we're not trying to change each other's minds. We're just here to offer some information. Also, ask me questions. I'd love to answer them. You know, because, like, I've sat down and had conversations with, like, a priest and some nuns about Planned Parenthood, about sex. I've talked to a few priests about sex, and I think they're great conversations. I love that I get to do that.
Yeah. So with the Ivrit on your arm, your tattoo, have you had any encounters since October 7th? Any negative
No,
encounters?
I haven't. Probably mostly because I've been wearing sleeves.
Oh,
this whole
oh yeah,
time.
it's getting a little
Because
chilly,
it's
and you
cold.
look. Yeah,
No, I haven't. But my parents were at the Macy's parade, and protesters stopped the parade, and then ended up going marching all the way down to the New York Public Library and putting red paint all over Stephen Schwartzman's memorial. And maybe I'm just ignorant, but what does Stephen Schwartzman Stephen Schwartzman? I think he was the founder of the public library. What does he have to do with this? But maybe he does. Maybe I'm ignorant and he does have something to do with it. But it's pretty scary here. I work for an agency, a childcare agency, and they had to release this message because one of their sitters was caught on tape and went viral tearing down the missing posters. And so many of the families that we serve in that agency are Jewish. It's New York, and I have friends who are Israeli Jews. I have friends who are born and raised in New York Jews. I have friends who are Scandinavian Jews, and they all are just and all of them considered themselves liberal at one point, and now are I definitely can't consider myself liberal. So it is, I feel like I'm in a very specific situation because I don't know if you saw that Instagram reel that was actor is distressed, not knowing if they should be pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. Because it's all of these reasons of why the liberal artistic types should be and are being pushed to be pro-Palestine. But it's I have Israeli friends. I have so many Israeli friends. The very close friends of mine, their cousins are on the front lines right now. And so, no, I'm I don't know. It's not that easy for me. And also, here's another thing, having an opinion about everything. I don't care what Beyonce thinks about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Why do influencers matter? That is the problem. We're getting a lot of commentary, not a lot of news. And I have lots of opinions about it.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good point because there are a lot of folks weighing in who don't know what the fuck they're talking about.
Yeah.
And the frameworks that are being applied. We've been talking about this in a few different versions of it, and it's this inclination to oversimplify, distill, in order to put people into this side or the other side. Mm-hmm. And you know what? We have to be able to hold space for the fact that I'm getting updates from my cousins on a daily basis just to make sure that everybody's okay.
I listened to that episode the other day.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. We did find out tragically that my cousin's nephew, her husband's nephew, was in fact killed on October 7th. He was missing, but we found out last week.
So
this shit is real.
Yeah.
And I can still hold space for wanting my cousins to be okay. And, knowing that they grew up with Palestinian friends and neighbors and work with and teach and, that there's a pluralistic society. But at the same time, hating just about everything Netanyahu legislatively has done. Not being I'm not a fan of his government to the degree that I know it's, that I know about it. We can hold space for all of this at the same time. We can hold space and have a heart for Palestinian civilians whose homes have been destroyed and who've died. And still be in favor of having Jews having a safe place to live in that region, because they don't have a safe place to live in Egypt. They don't know if you look at anyway. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. Jordan, So, that talk about a whole other conversation. So, let's see. Do you have any questions for me?
Well, I feel like whatever questions I'm going to ask, it could go on a total rabbit hole.
Totally.
I am curious, and I'm sorry that I don't know this already based on past listens, but what is, did you do your own version of faith deconstruction? What was that? Or you still consider yourself a Christian? Where are you at with that? Not to put people in boxes. I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's okay. I do still consider myself a Christian because the Jesus that I encountered in New Testament it really holds it's the most consistent, coherent set of answers to basic existential theological questions that I had been developing since I can remember. Sitting in Yom Kippur services and reading I didn't speak Hebrew, but reading the English translation of Ecclesiastes, for example, and wondering, what does this mean? Like, having certain questions about meaning and the Rabbi Jesus. And the first time that I saw it, I didn't even recognize that it was the Sermon on the Mount. But his Devar Torah, his explanation of Torah, was the most profound explanation of Torah that I'd ever heard. So I can't shake that, and I don't want to let an upside-down Bible-waving freaking Donald goddamn Trump, and I mean goddamn Trump, take that away. Like he doesn't get that, And folks who are Constantinian. Let's call him something else. Like I had this conversation with Tim Alberta last week. Like,
yeah, I can't wait to listen.
Who gets to claim the word evangelical? That's a beautiful word, evangelical, right? Who gets to claim that word? Why don't you name a freaking party after it? Why don't you name it the Trump party in the Trump denomination of Christianity? Take that, but don't take evangelical. So anyway, all that to say, like, yeah, I feel more Jewish than ever. In fact, I've been going to Chabad on Shabbos on Saturday mornings for Torah service because I feel I've never felt more Jewish than ever, and I connect. Right. By the way, just a side note, like going to a kiddush, like a lunch after the Torah service with my friends from Chabad. We in the shul we eat and we hang out with each, we break bread. And the conversations, like the theological conversations, if you want to know what Matthew 23 actually looked like, the conversation, Jesus was yelling at whether it was the Pharisees or the Zealots or the Essenes or whoever he was, like, this is just Jews having a conversation. We're not arguing. We're just having a conversation. So that's... Anyway.
That is so funny because, oh my gosh, my friend Miley is Israeli. And I was talking about something and I was like, like, the story in the Bible where Jesus is like flipping the tables because and I can't remember, and she was like, I'm sorry, there's a story in the New Testament where Jesus is flipping Bibles. That's the most Jewish or flipping tables. That's the most Jewish thing I've ever heard. Like,
yeah, everybody thinks this is a historic thing. No, that's just Tuesday. What are you talking about? Yeah. All right, before we wrap up, is there anything? I feel like there's so much more I could have asked you, but is there any? We're gonna get to the business part of it, so people know where to find you and God, Sex, and Rich People and all that. But before we get to the business part of it, is there anything important I forgot to ask you?
I don't think so. I mean, there are lots of tangents we could have gone on in terms of like Planned Parenthood and healthcare and women's health and health, sexual education and all of that. There's a lot there, but maybe we just do another episode at some point because I do think there's a lot that really just needs to be revised about healthcare in our country and so there's so much more we could talk about.
One little tidbit, maybe it's a teaser for a future conversation, but I was so encouraged to learn. I didn't even know this part about Planned Parenthood, but the counseling that they provided to you during a really traumatic, after a traumatic experience in a difficult time in your life was so encouraging. A lot of folks think, oh no, they're the ones who just want to, kill babies at any time, and no, dude, like, just stop talking. You're not helping yourself. You're not helping. And by the way, that's not Planned Parenthood,
Yeah. Well, so I will say really quick, and I do know that we have to wrap up.
Yeah, that's okay.
But I know literal friends of mine who have been on and off Broadway multiple times, have created entire careers or in their 40s. They still go to Planned Parenthood for their women's health because they know it is the one place they can go that regardless of their working situation, their insurance will always be accepted. So in periods where you're on Medicaid, I've been on Medicaid for a lot of my time in New York City. And it's very, very hard to get into doctor's appointments. You will wait months. And I would say New York has a way better Medicaid system than other states. And so that's what kept me going to Planned Parenthood for so long is I was I just know it's the one place I can always get an appointment, no questions asked. And then So their services, if you find yourself in acute need for sexual trauma services or something like that. So what I did is I requested to, and it was like right after it happened, like the morning after, I called, I said, I need to be tested. And then they connected me with, I need to be tested because I've been raped. And then they connected me with a counselor. That counselor gave me all the information. We actually, like, if you do have something, it's not going to show up right away. We will set that appointment for you. But in the meantime, can you get to the ER in the next 24 to 48 hours? We'll set you up with a social worker and a doctor, and you'll take care of everything from there. So I called out of work. I did that. And then there is where I got all of my preventative medication, like preventative HIV medication, all of that. They set me up with HIV testing for like up to 8 months follow-up. And they set me up with a sexual trauma therapist. I didn't get into sexual trauma therapy until like months later, but that's another story. And they documented it all. And I just kept asking, like, this is free? Are you sure this is free? This is free? And they were like, yes, everything is covered. Everything is taken care of, because Planned Parenthood partners with nonprofits, places like the CBTC in New York City. And what they do is they have advocates, and those are those social workers that meet with us. And they do like free, like those workers, some of them are unpaid. They're volunteer advocates. And then they pair you with the doctors, and like they have all these services, but Planned Parenthood connects you with them. So yes, Planned Parenthood is an amazing, amazing resource.
That's great.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think it's Daniel. Is that the
Yeah, not his real name, but yeah, that's what we call him in the yeah.
I hope there's a Daniel character in your series, and
yes.
That character is just, I love that character, because it's almost great. He's like so brilliant and so on point that it is indeed funny. Like It's like, oh, why did I think of that? That makes so much sense. Why aren't we all thinking this? So before we go, how can folks follow you, find more info about God, sex, and rich people, and all the great work that you're doing?
Yeah. So, what I say is I live in New York, mostly in New York, but also mostly on Instagram. And so you can find me on Instagram. It's Mattie Jo Cowsert. So MattiJoCowsert. I am also on TikTok, but not super often because that platform scares me. And it's Mattie Jo Cowsert. So the word squirt, it's super inappropriate, but it's funny. And then also, most importantly, my email list, MattieJoCowsert.com, / or / I don't know. I think it's / God, sex, and rich people. The word and, not an ampersand. But if you just go to my website, MattieJoCowsert.com, you can find my blog super easily. Subscribe. I will not bomb your inbox. I promise. But you can be on my list of updates about what's going on with the book. And as soon as it is on pre-sale, everyone will know. Everyone will know, because this has been such a long journey, and I'm just ready for people to read the book. Yeah,
so, it's awesome.
Yes.
And those links will be in the show notes for the IG and your website. We'll definitely make sure about that. I can't believe, I don't think we tackled head on EXvangelical, but in a way we've been talking about EXvangelical the whole time without really talking about it.
Yeah.
So maybe that'll be for the next one. It's still going to be, but to be fair, you have been talking about the life of an EXvangelical. So it's been really great. Thank you so much for doing this, MJ.
Thank you for having me. This has been so wonderful. Yeah,
really fun. I hope that's not the last time we talk. And, best wishes for all the exciting stuff. I'm envious. I have to admit, I'm a little envious. The whole New York theater thing, it's in my blood. And I wish I was there with you.
Yes. Well, I'm not as much in theater anymore. I do mostly on-camera work. I transitioned out of theater. Not that I would love to be in a theater piece. I just don't want to sing. Don't make me do musicals anymore. That's behind me. But I would love to be in a play. So if there are any casting directors listening, check out my website.
Fair enough. Awesome. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review, write that review. It's so helpful. Wherever you get your podcasts, tell a friend about talking politics and religion without killing each other. We're really easy to recommend. It's politicsandreligion.us. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey, S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan. Now, Go talk some politics and religion and sex and anything you want, really. But do it with gentleness and respect. And have a great week.
Yeah.